so much for being here this morning. Glad to see you. If you're here in the building, if you're joining us online, welcome. Glad that we still have that opportunity and way to connect. We are going to be continuing this morning our series out of 2 Timothy. And if you have been in and out due to circumstances and or the terrible weather that we've had for the last 3 weeks, decided to mix it up a little bit, and the sun showed up today, so I was glad to see that on a Sunday morning, that it's not freezing and or raining and or doing both of those things at the same time, as it seems to have done for the last few weeks or so. So this is 2 Timothy, written by Paul to Timothy. Timothy was at the church at Ephesus and going through some difficulties with that church. The scholars and people that study this way more than I do would tell you that this was written somewhere in the mid to late 60s, and this would have happened after Nero burned a huge chunk of Rome. So the best understanding is that Nero had this gigantic building project that he wanted to do. He took out a good portion of Rome. As you might imagine, Romans were upset about that. And so it turned bad for Nero, and he decided to blame the fire on the Christians. So things got bad for the Christians, many put to death. And in this case, Paul is writing this letter from prison. He was imprisoned potentially 5 to 6 years before this, but in more of a house arrest type thing where it was still not particularly uncomfortable for him. But in this case, it was very uncomfortable. And as you read 2 Timothy through the entire thing, it becomes fairly clear that Paul understands that he's about to die. This was a much more significant imprisonment, uncomfortable, wasn't able to move back and forth, necessarily see visitors like his first one was in the early 60s. So some of the people that I read this week called this Paul's last will and testament. And so I started thinking about, what you would say to your family and friends, or things that you would say on your deathbed, or things that have been said on people's deathbed. And so I looked up some famous last words by different people. So all of these can only be verified through the internet. I was not present for any of these, so potentially these could be slightly modified. But here are some examples. Steve Jobs' last words were, "Oh wow, oh wow, oh wow." Just interesting to think, the guy that did Apple and all those creative things, what he saw that impressed him. Emily Dickinson said, "I must go in now, for the fog is rising." Great author, even last words, great author. James Rogers, he was a convicted murderer in Utah. When standing before the firing squad and asked for his last request, said, "Please bring me a bulletproof vest." John Wayne, Humphrey Bogart, Ernest Hemingway all had strong professions of love for their wives. Nostradamus famously predicted his own death, saying the night before he died, "Tomorrow at sunrise, I will no longer be here." Harriet Tubman said, "Swing low, sweet chariot." Leonardo da Vinci said, "I have offended God and mankind because my work did not reach the quality it should have." I'm like, dang. If Da Vinci didn't think his stuff was good enough, I got a long way to go. Anyway, again, the knowledge of the internet potentially maybe err here and there, but some really interesting and significant people, if that's something that you want to read more about. But we're going to read 2 Timothy chapter 3, and I have to tell you, I am up here today because Pastor Doug is not in town. he and one of our elders, Donnie, have driven out to California and are now on their way back. Again, if you have been in and out the last few weeks, we've hired Kim Lewis as our new children's director, and Kim is coming to us from California. We couldn't find anyone in Alaska, so reached out to California. And so I want you to know that as we read these verses, Pastor Doug literally would prefer to drive across the country twice rather than be here and talk through these verses. He's going to tell you he's a good guy and he's trying to help out staff. But when you read these with me this morning, you'll understand that was the choice that he made. So if you are in the Pew Bible, we're on page 1198. If not, we are going to read 2 Timothy chapter 3, verses 1 through 9. But mark this, there will be terrible times in the last days. People will be lovers of themselves, lovers of money, boastful, proud, abusive, disobedient to their parents, ungrateful, unholy, without love, unforgiving, slanderous, without self-control, brutal, not lovers of the good, treacherous, rash, conceited, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God, having a form of godliness but denying its power, have nothing to do with such people. They are the kind who worm their way into homes and gain control over gullible women who are loaded down with sins and are swayed by all kinds of evil desires, always learning but never able to come to a knowledge of the truth. Just as Jannes and Jambres opposed Moses, so also these teachers oppose the truth. They are men of depraved minds, who as far as the faith is concerned are rejected. But they will not get very far, because as in the case of those men, their folly will be clear to everyone. So, you're not going to see a lot of church marquees with scriptures from 2 Timothy chapter 3. Come join us this Sunday for terrible times. But it's something that Paul wrote. It's something that Paul thought was significant enough to include in a letter to someone he believed was potentially his protege, someone who he was handing off responsibility to lead, to bring the Christian movement continuing through the process. This potentially his last letter, maybe him even being aware of the fact that it was his last letter or one of his last letters, still felt like that was something that needed to be included. So I just want to give you two things that kind of got me distracted when I was reading this, and you may not have been distracted at all. So if so, that's fine. But these are just things that kind of stick out to me. In verse 1, it talks about there will be terrible times in the last days. And we're, coming up on 2,000 years, give or take, after this was written. And there are other scriptures that reference being in the last days or what the last days are. And specifically, when Paul is talking about the last days here, it is not like on the calendar, like Jesus is coming next month, we're in the last days. The way that this is interpreted is that they're kind of ebbs and flows experiences like this. These are seasons that Christians will go through when things are terrible as described here. And then there will be other times where Christians and the Christian faith are not experiencing these things. And when we read about last days are the time from which Christ left the earth in his ascension to whenever God sends him back. So last days, in my brain, I'm thinking like, okay, it's coming tomorrow, it's coming in a month, it's coming in, a year, and yet this was thousands of years ago. And so I think potentially people can read this and say, well, everybody just says the last days just in case. And really, this last days is not about what we would see on the calendar. This last days is this entire time frame between when Jesus left and when he'll return. The second is Jannes and Jambres, because I'd never heard of these people. I have been in church theoretically since 9 months before I entered the earth, and I did not know who they were. It's not often that there are new people to me, so I looked them up, and this is the only place where they're referenced in the Bible. Whether or not this is their actual name, we don't know, but these are two individuals who were the magicians in the court of Pharaoh. So if you think about when Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh and they were trying to warn him and say, hey, the Jewish people need to be let go. There are going to be some really bad things that happen to your people. And he had the opportunity to show in front of Pharaoh some of the things to prove that God was on their side. These two individuals were magicians in Pharaoh's court who were able to mimic and duplicate some of the same things that Aaron and Moses did for Pharaoh as a warning. Completely as an aside, one of the cool things that I thought was cool is that Aaron threw down his rod and it turned into a serpent. And then these two magicians did the same thing and turned theirs into a serpent. And then Aaron's snake ate their snakes. I just thought that was cool. It probably has nothing to do with anything we're talking about this morning. I just thought that was cool. And then Jewish lore teaches, there's no written documentation of this. This is just how it is taught in the Jewish faith, is that Jannes and Jambres, after seeing and experiencing all of the plagues, converted to Judaism and left with the Jews in the Exodus, and were two of the proponents and participants that convinced Aaron to build the golden calf while Moses was on Mount Sinai. And if that is true, we'll see why that might be even more significant as we finish up the verses this morning, though that's just how it's taught in the Jewish faith and through lore. There's no actual documentation that that is true or not true. So I think when we look at these verses, it's not really a lot of directives. It's a lot of descriptions. And it's not a lot of descriptions that make us warm and fuzzy and look forward to going through these things. And so really for me, it's still significant as followers of Christ, after we read these verses, after we look at how this is laid out to Timothy from Paul, it's about our response. And so I think that sometimes we can look at people in the Bible, be it Paul, be it Timothy, and make them out to be somebody they were not. Like, Timothy was a normal dude. We're normal human beings. And so I think when we look at this and we think about what was Timothy's response, we also have to look at ourselves and think about what should our response be. And so if you are like me, and that could be a potentially dangerous thing, my immediate response is, let's hit the road, Jack. Like, let's get the people who believe what I believe and don't want to go through any of this. Let's go find some land somewhere. Let's build a little commune, and then we won't have to experience anything like this. The problem, of course, is running and hiding away from the world doesn't really line up well with Matthew 28. It's not very Great Commission-y to take people who believe what you believe and go hide in a corner and just wait. So when Jesus gives us the directive to therefore go and make disciples of all nations, it doesn't really seem to jive with hide away, because it's going to be some bad stuff happening. And when you read Jesus' prayer for the disciples and his prayer for the believers, he says, "My prayer is not that you take them out of the world, but that you protect them from the evil one." So there goes response number one. We can't run and hide and build a commune and have gardens and just hold on tight and wait till Jesus returns. So I think what our response should be and what Christ would ask us to do if he were here is to be prepared. Because though as Floridians, it's really not a big deal till it gets to be like category 4 or so, part of what you do when you know something is coming is you prepare for it. So we are told, Timothy is told, that there will be terrible times in the last days. Whether we are experiencing that now, whether we have experienced it in the past or will experience it in the future is up for debate. But what is not up for debate is that as followers of Christ, we have to be ready, whether we experience that or not. And so I think for us, when we think about being followers of Christ and being prepared, there's two pieces to it. The first is that we have to reflect on ourselves. That's the worst. Because we are way less awesome when we reflect on ourselves and think about how we are in comparison to Christ than when we have the opportunity to look at other people and say, see how bad they are? I would never do that. How dare they? You know, there are psychology studies that if you ask a group of people, please don't holler out answers. If you ask a group of people to compare themselves to those that they interact with on a daily basis, so it could be neighbors, it could be family, it could be peers, it could be people that you work with, and they are asked, are you better with ethics than the average person that you interact with? They come up with the answer. And if you ask them, are you more or less judgmental than those you interact with on a daily basis? And if they're asked, are you more or less generous than those you interact with on a daily basis? 85% of people give themselves more credit for the good things than the people that they interact with. So most people say, yes, I am more generous than the people that I interact with. Yes, I am less judgmental than the people I interact with. So whatever the positive outcome is, 85% of people see themselves more positively than the people that they interact with. And of course, the question is, who are your friends? So just a little psychology study there. So, but we have to begin with ourselves. And even if you look at the list, when Paul talks about this, verse 2, the very first thing he says, people will be lovers of themselves. And if you are a lover of yourself, if you're prioritizing yourself before you prioritize everybody else and everything else, these descriptions happen a little more easily. And these descriptions don't sound as bad because really you're looking out for number one. So it's not that you love money, it's that, well, it takes money in order to take care of my family. And what does God want me to do? Not take care of my family? Boastful. Well, you know, God's given me these gifts. You don't think it's important that I let other people know how great God has made me? Proud, abusive. All of those things can be tweaked and changed and modified where it sounds like someone is just trying to do the right thing. But they're focused on themselves. They're making them number one. They are getting the credit. They are getting the prestige. And so if we begin by looking at ourselves, I think the question we have to ask ourselves is, what is it that we do that makes us number 2 or number 3 or number 4? Are we involved in some type of community service project? Are we involved in something that allows us to serve other people. Because it's through service that you have to make yourself less. Because somebody else's needs become more important than your own. And so you are serving that individual, serving that group of people, making yourself less than. Making yourself number 2 or number 3 or number 4 on the list of people in your life. And if you know what that thing is, how can you do it more regularly? How can you make it a part of your life? Maybe it is a part of your life. How can it be something that you participate in on a regular basis, that you participate in maybe more often than what you're doing now? Because when you are repeatedly reminding yourself, when you're repeatedly being exposed to opportunities where somebody else is more important, it's really hard to give yourself the glory. It's really hard to shine the light on you when you're constantly trying to take care of and serve and meet the needs of other people. And so Doug has said this a few times, and this always stuck with me because I was around in that generation where we had the WWJD bracelets, and he talks about how really the best understanding of that is maybe a little tweaked. Not what would Jesus do, because what Jesus was called to do is not what we're called to do. But maybe the best way to understand it is, what would Jesus do if he were me? If he were an educator, and if he were on staff at a church, and if he were involved in civic organizations in the neighborhood, what would he do to ensure that the love of God is being modeled, is being shared, is being provided to those that are not currently connected? I think he'd probably do a movie night Friday night at 6:30. Maybe offer free popcorn and Coke to the community. Let them know that church is not scary. Let them know that this is a place where they can come and find love, where they can come and ask questions, where they can come and be accepted for who they are. We'll see. Maybe he would find organizations that he can connect with that can serve the community through the local elementary school. Because when families see that we love kids, they want to see what's up. They want to see what is significant about this church, what is significant about this organization. And so one thing we're doing next month is Murray Hill Preservation Association is going to start publicizing a book drive. And we're going to run a book drive so that people can donate either new or gently used books. Those books can be given to the students at the end of school, and they can take them home and have access to books throughout the summer when not all students in our community have that access. And so what we've done as a church is we've come alongside them financially, and we're going to be purchasing tote bags. And the tote bags say, reading is fun, I love to read, motivational statements like that, so that when the students get the books, they can put those in the tote bag, and that tote bag can be something that they take with them home with the books, but also potentially throughout the neighborhood in different ways and in different places. And so, I mean, that is a very small thing in the grand scheme of life, but little things that remind people, that show the community, that say, this is not a country club. We haven't come here to hide out and wait until all the bad stuff is over. We're here to walk with you. We're here to experience life together, because that's what Christ has called us to do. And so I think when we talk about preparation, we begin with reflecting on ourselves, and then this is a little bit like what Doug talked about last week, but we have to build our own knowledge. We have to be able to understand truth when it's spoken, but also understand half-truths and understand partial truths And that takes us back, I think, to the story of Jannes and Jambres. If they indeed decided to leave Egypt, professed that they were following the Jewish traditions, they would have been seen as very significant. They saw what God did. They have now given up the old life, and they are now a part of us. And yet, potentially, when the Jewish people were at their weakest, had been 40 days without their leader, didn't know exactly what to do next, little voices, little whispers, things beside them, things around them started bringing in the belief systems of other cultures, started bringing in ideas. You know, he got us out of Egypt, but was that really God, or was it something else? Did it have anything to do with these two individuals? Did they assist? Did they convince Pharaoh? And so now they've got a little bit of truth. Maybe they're following the Jewish tradition, but they've also got some half-truth. They've also got some opportunity to bring incorrect and false teachings to the Jewish people. And when we look at these verses, verse 5 warns us. These things will have a form of godliness, but deny its power. It's not going to be horrible and blatant and obvious to every eye as soon as it happens that this is the wrong thing. It's going to have some half-truths. There's going to be a little bit to it that actually that part is right. So are we sure this other part is wrong? If we're building our knowledge, we'll know. Yeah, you're right. That is right. But that right there, no, sir. No, ma'am. We can live with this, not that. And so the famous takeaway from the relationship between Paul and Timothy is the idea and the thought of, if we have a Paul and a Timothy in our life, is there somebody in our life who functions like a Paul for us? Somebody who can tell us exactly how it is? Somebody who we can go to when we need clarification, when we need Christian wisdom, when we need somebody to answer our wonderings, when we need someone to motivate us, when we need someone to smack us? Paul had that relationship with Timothy, and then the other way. Do you have a Timothy? Are you somebody's Paul? Is there somebody younger in faith that you are communicating with, that you are talking with, that you are interacting with, that you are able to use the wisdom that you currently have, the truth that you know, the knowledge that you've built, to share that with somebody else as they are progressing in their faith? And both of those people can be significant in your life, and you can be significant in theirs. And so as we look at these really unfun verses, it doesn't matter if we like it or not. Because again, we can argue that we're in the middle of it now, or it's happened in the past, or it's going to happen in the future. You might be right on all three. But for us, as followers of Christ, what Paul is telling Timothy is be prepared. So know that our call is not to run and hide, is not to stay away, is not to just wait it out. Our call is to be prepared, to reflect on ourselves, to make sure our heart is right, to make sure our mind is right, and to build our knowledge of truth. Find people around us that we can go to who have been through more, who have experienced more. Learn from them. Take that learning and pass it on to somebody who is younger in faith than you, that you can build up and that you can ensure have the opportunity to share that truth, to know that truth, and to be able to identify half-truths if and when it comes. Let's pray.